Okay, hello and welcome to our second Thinking Beyond webinar. As usual, I have just a few quick announcements before we get started. And the first is that our next Thinking Beyond is October 30th at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, which is 6 p.m. Pacific and 9 p.m. Eastern. And our guest presenter is Brian Keating, and his talk is, Was There a Big Bang? Our registration will open mid-October. And I will send my usual emails and we'll post to social media for that. For tonight, if anyone has any questions at any point during the talk, please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those at the end of the hour. And then lastly, this is being recorded and we will post it to YouTube later this week. So you can watch it again or share it with anyone who you think might be interested. And that is all I have. So I will turn it over to the director of the Beyond Center and moderator for tonight, Paul Davies.
Well, good evening, everybody, or good morning if you're on a different time zone. Very warm welcome to this session of Thinking Beyond. For those of you who have followed us over the years, we used to be called Ask a Physicist. So welcome back. We have a real treat in store for today because we're going to hear from Nirosha Murugan, who she'll explain a little bit about her career, but she comes to us from Waterloo in Canada, where it's a little later in the evening, and she's going to be talking about the magnetic dimension of life, a topic that I've always found deeply fascinating. So we very much look forward to hearing what she is going to say. So tonight, I'm the only one from the Beyond Center participating in this. And so the way it'll work is that Nirosha will talk for half an hour, maybe a little longer, and then she and I will have some conversation before opening it to you, our viewers, with your questions. So without further ado, I'll ask Nirosha to begin her presentation and start by just telling us a little bit about her career and her background. Over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. So as Paul introduced, I'm Nirosha. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Tissue Biophysics. Just a little bit about my training and interests has always been centered around biophysical signaling. So I did most of my training in Northern Ontario in neuroscience and moved to the Allen Discovery Center with Michael Levin at Tufts University, where I explored more of the bioelectrical signaling and regenerative medicine. I'm now a PI and Canada Research Chair in Waterloo, Canada, and my main focus, which kind of is a good segue into what I'd like to share with you, is really trying to understand how biological information is processed. It's been a fascination of mine to see how intricate the cell signaling mechanism is to essentially create shape and structure. And it's really quite fascinating to see cells don't just communicate with each other, but they also communicate with their environment. And typically in this scale of things, what we have seen is biophysics, bioengineering, molecular biology really just focus in the microenvironment scale. And I argue today that cells and tissues actually communicate with their environment at a larger scale, and that is kind of where the whole magnetic language comes in. What we know right now in terms of how cells and tissues typically pattern is this intricate gradient of morphogens, molecules, genes, and those somehow work together to form normal pattern tissues. And in disease states, what most would argue is that it's these signaling modalities and genes and molecules where they go wrong that get these disease states. And something that really didn't sit well with me when I was a student learning about cell communication is in pattern formation, usually there are these gene regulatory networks that is commonly associated with how cells form pattern and shape. And if I were to ask you rhetorically, looking at this gene regulatory network, what shape this would form? And if I manipulated each one of these genes, how would that shape then be changed? And, I'd be hard pressed to see that if you would actually kind of guess that this gene regulatory network is highly conserved and is involved in limb formation. And I bring this up as to the introduction to our conversation today, because I argue, and I would like to challenge everyone to think that these molecules, these signals, these genes are part of an intricate dynamics that actually communicate with the larger environment at scale, and that might give us some information of how biology truly does communicate in a sort of big picture. And that's kind of where I start my conversation to the introduction of magnetic fields. All life, all rocks and planets that exist within our universe has some form or shaped by a magnetic field. In the case of our blue planet, the atmosphere itself is protected from the harsh solar winds and solar particles due to, in part, because of these geomagnetic fields. So it's kind of clear enough to say that all life on this planet has been submerged and evolved through these magnetic field generations. And there are research that it has been shown through modeling efforts that even sun-like stars show that magnetic fields and how the flux lines develop play a key role in making that planet itself conducive to life, I should say. And typically, when we think about geomagnetic concepts or fluctuations, we think of this beautiful phenomena that exists on our planet, the aurora borealis. And this is actually a picture that was taken in our backyard here in Northern Ontario a couple of weeks ago when we had a geomagnetic storm. And for those who may not know, a geomagnetic storm is when there is a coronal mass ejection from our star that causes a perturbation in our geomagnetic fields, causing this, light dances around our atmosphere. So, beginning our conversation with magnetic fields and biology, I want to introduce you to this phrase that was given by a French scientist in 1882, where for a very long time people have been interested in how physical forces, essentially from the atmosphere to the depths of the ocean, could direct animal behavior. And the reason for this is because we argue that if from the beginning of the inception of our planet that there was this magnetic field, then all life forms have to have evolved in these magnetic fields. And there's only one thing that encompasses throughout time. Gravitation field may be one of them, but the Earth's magnetic field is the other. And for those that may not know, there are two sources of these magnetic fields. If you take our planet and you chop it in half, you'll see in the middle, there's this iron core, and this iron core creates the main field. But around our planet itself, we have this geomagnetic field that is pretty constant. And the intensities of these fields are actually very, very weak, in the order of about 25 microtesla, much, orders of magnitude, much weaker than what might be coming off of your cell phone. And so this interest in magnetic fields and biology has existed for a very long time. Researchers, including myself, have kind of seen this evolution and the boom of geomagnetic fields in biology within the last, I would say, decade or so. So a scoping review has shown that from 1970s to now, how we view the role of geomagnetic fields has changed. About 21,000 peer-reviewed journals from Web of Science and Scopus show that we have a lot of evidence and a lot of interest in how magnetic fields are perceived in biological systems. And that's something that I'll touch upon in this idea of magnetoreception, how we sense and how biology senses these magnetic fields and how it guides our behavior. And so, as I was saying, there's a lot of data to support that magnetic field sensing is something that most navigating and homing organisms utilize in their behaviors. So this is the whole area of magnetic field sensing, where you have from birds to turtles. What they do is they actually use the magnetic fields, which change from the poles, so the magnetic pole of north and south. Those flux lines actually change as you go throughout the equator. And it's hypothesized and actually validated very well that these organisms use these flux lines, which as they get through the equator, they become a lot more narrow, to navigate and move throughout the earth for their natural behaviors. What's interesting is that, non-homing and non-locomotory organisms like the fox also utilize these magnetic fields in their behaviors as well. And there was this interesting study that actually showed that fox use these flux lines, maybe not in long distances like these migratory organisms, but they use these flux lines to locate their prey within short distance. And sort of on that lower hand image, you actually see that within their retina, they have these molecules that actually allows for the sensing of these magnetic fields to locate these organisms underground, where their visual perception actually may not allow for that. So it's the pervasiveness of magnetic field exposure in biology is well established, and it's irrefutable. What some concepts that might have some controversy is how organisms sense these magnetic fields. One organism that actually points to us very clearly how it uses more magnetic fields in their own biological physiology is bacteria. There are certain strains of bacteria that have these magnetosome chains. And if you look clearly inside of these magnetosome chains, they have these magnetic sensitive particles inside of them that, when in the presence of a magnetic field, if you remember a magnet having a north and south pole, they move these magnetite particles that allow them to move towards these polarized direction. This allows for the organism to essentially move in a passive way orient themselves towards the Earth's geomagnetic field. Now, as I mentioned, this has been well established in migratory organisms, though there might be some controversy on how, in terms of, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I also kind of want to introduce the natural geomagnetic effects in non-migratory behaviors. We know, the planet Earth is predominantly made up of water, so we know that these applied and natural geomagnetic fields influences water dynamics. There's plenty of research that has emphasized that magnetic fields can change and these weak bonds that exist between water molecules, allowing them to either become more acidic or alkaline. And since most of cell physiology and biological systems are within water, it makes sense that the next phenomenon associated with the central dogma of life, going from a gene to a protein, is also influenced by these geomagnetic fields. Along that note, there is lots of evidence, and I'll highlight today, that the geomagnetic fields can actually influence cell shape. So this bath of magnetic fields that we've evolved in actually can control cell physiology, from the shape that we form, the proliferation, the movement, the death, all the minimal intricacies associated with cell physiology and tissue physiology is governed by these geomagnetic fields. So the big question that everyone's really interested in is how. How do animals, how do humans, how do lower organisms, plants, how do they measure the influence of magnetic fields? How do biology sense these magnetic fields? And I argue with, and something that I'd like to think about as throughout my research, is how can we leverage magnetic fields to shape biological communication, to either reprogram disease states or leverage them towards various kinds of evolution in our biology. There's this fantastic review that was recently written that emphasizes these things, and how we do and how we measure these magnetic fields is highly determined about how we do our experiments in a lab. In observational studies, they've shown that certain kinds of animals, they sense and influence these magnetic fields by electromagnetic conduction. In animals such as insects, they might have these particles in brain tissue, magnetite, that allows them to sense these magnetic fields. As we know that magnetite, having iron, is sensitive to these magnetic fields and can be manipulated by magnetic fields, which changes their behavior. Other studies have emphasized, these knockdown studies where we cut down nerve tissue to see how those loss of function studies are responsive to magnetic fields. And other studies have shown by manipulating these fields in two ways, either inducing a magnetic field And the most common is hypomagnetic interactions, where we reduce the magnetic field, the local geomagnetic field that an animal might be exposed to, and see how that influences their behavior. And this has been such a point of controversy in the field of magnetic biology or magnetobiology. And all of this is because, and I argue, is that our devices and our tools that we have developed so far in the biological space are not there. The technology is not advanced enough for us to interact with the advancements that we've made, let's say, in genetic or molecular biology, to kind of correlate the two between the physical world and the molecular and biological world. But what we do know, which I'll kind of emphasize today, is that there is a potential of advancement to be made and looking at this chemical magnetoreception. And that kind of focuses on this radical repair mechanism, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but ultimately saying that, you know, we have other molecules that might be magnetosensitive, such as cryptochrome. And what I'd like to argue, which I'll talk about closer to the end of our talk today, is looking at this interference theory. If we develop technology that interacts with inherent biological magnetic signals, then we have a really fine-tuned way to interact with our environment, our Earth signals, and biological signals as well. So, as I mentioned, the geomagnetic space in terms of interaction with biological tissues and animal behaviors has been well studied. And if you notice the space in which these are studied, you might see that, you know, reducing the local geomagnetic field, bringing it down to near zero fields around the animal, you might see changes in calcium signal, physiology that's usually associated with calcium. And where you see calcium is typically in bone tissue, in the heart, and also in the brain. And that's where we see a lot of the advancements that have been made in this hypomagnetic space. You see that, as you see here, there's many that have shown that just reducing the magnetic field in an organism space can cause bone loss, can cause changes in cardiac activity, in neural formation, neural behaviors, and also in these effects in these hypomagnetic fields are also sustained throughout multiple generations. So this might give us that we're actually manipulating genomic and DNA material just by reducing the magnetic field, the local geomagnetic field, that could have long-lasting and generational effects. So these works kind of give us some way of saying that these magnetic fields are actually instructive in biological tissue. They're not just there as a way for supporting, but they're actually part of normal physiology. And this is something that I've been really passionate about, to actually prove that these magnetic fields that exist at a single cell level are instructive to how to form tissues. And actually, it's those electromagnetic signals that can go haywire to give us disease states. And if we find a way to decode that electromagnetic signature of tissues, then we have a way to manipulate all levels of biology for form and function. So many reviews have actually, again, emphasized that these hypomagnetic and also magnetic fields can have effects on cell size, cell number. You can see here that it affects development, mortality, longevity, circadian rhythms. And that's something that is also emphasized, is that these magnetic fields could actually be a secondary Zeitgeber, so regulating your internal clock. Some experiments have highlighted that the pineal gland, so a structure that's deep within your brain that regulates your circadian clock through the expression and release of melatonin, is actually light sensitive, but also magnetic sensitive. So we're very well established of the phenomenon that our brains are very light sensitive and are regulated by the big sun. But we also now have evidence to support that our brains and our tissues, the clock that regulates biological rhythm, is also controlled by local magnetic fields and these geomagnetic fields as well. So let's talk about humans then. So simple organisms like tardigrades all the way up to mice are clearly affected by these local geomagnetic fields. Can humans then perceive and sense these magnetic fields as the lower organisms? And there are these great, fantastic studies that have been done from the late 60s all the way up to now, but there's always been conflicting advancements in this space. But what we do know with the latest technology that we have, and what we're seeing here is an individual that has an EEG, or an electroencephalographic cap on their head, which is recording electrical signals coming from their brain. And what they've showed in these studies, they've taken these individuals that are that are recording their brain activity and put them in these chambers, as you see here, where they have a reduced local geomagnetic field, and where researchers and scientists can manipulate the electromagnetic field around them. So as the magnetic field changes, do the brain then respond to these changes in a sort of sensory type modality? And what they find, which is very interesting, is the alpha rhythms. So the rhythms that are usually associated with 4 to 7 hertz of wake cycle, and also sensory perception, increases when the magnetic field is on as compared to when the magnetic field is turned off. So the brain is responding in such a way that as if there is some sort of sensory information coming into the brain just by the application and reduction geomagnetic field. Now, again, the question goes back to how. And if we kind of deep dive into that, aspect that we know that is similar to the avian brain, so the bird brain, that has these known sensors, these humans may have human cryptochrome, use it to locomote? Do we use it in our 3D space? Just very systematic. How much of our brain human behavior? But what we know at a system in the geomagnetic field, and if you remember that encompasses our Earth and protects it from solar winds, when we have this produces these high perturbation in some cases, when it gets high enough, when we measure these solar winds, it can cause reception on our changes. What's interesting enough is also at a society level. What we see through correlational studies is that solar storms, I should say, we get psychiatric illnesses, suicide attempts, homicides, hospital administration, all this to say altered at an towards these altered another highly electromagnetic is the heart. And we also see that there are correlated high geomagnetic storm events and sudden cardiac deaths, arrhythmias, SIDS, or what we might colloquially call them as sudden infant death syndrome, and epilepsy. So all of this correlation and data that has been accumulated for centuries now over many areas of the world, we can kind of argue that perhaps maybe because we have this, human cryptochrome, individual proteins in our brains, that these magnetic fields that are encompassing the planet could act as our secondary Zeitgeber. It might be this other phenomenon that's controlling our biological clock. And some questions that, that'd be great to kind of collaborate with physicists to see is, as these magnetic fields change from polar shifts from the North Pole to the South Pole, do these magnetic fields cause, long-term changes from a societal impact? Like, how are these changing our human behaviors? And I guess, kind of want to also emphasize, most of the work, again, has been done through these hypomagnetic fields, especially in neurophysiological cases. And I share with you this other study where you can actually see the geometric shape of these exposure devices, where it actually reduces the magnetic field intensity by many orders of magnitude. As you see, the magnetic field in this case, the geomagnetic field is quite high, and hypermagnetic is near zero. And we see changes like in brain activity in this study, where they see anxiety-like behaviors And long-term exposure into these hypomagnetic chambers actually produces drastic enough structural change in the hippocampus that's typically associated with memory that produces long-term decline in cognitive function. Now, what I'm really interested in is patterning. That's kind of where I started off this conversation. So most of the tissue, as I said, is usually involved with brain or cardiac tissue that's usually electrical labile and has a magnetic inherent field. But what about these other scenarios where we have in development? And our own research has shown that if you take a developing, not an embryo, but a developing organism, as you see here, these are frog tadpoles, but if you put them in a shielded chamber in a hypomagnetic scenario where we've reduced the local field as this organism is developing, we can see all sorts of structural defects that's associated with mispatterning. So this is kind of where I get this interest of, are these magnetic fields instructive, and do we use these local geomagnetic disturbances in fields to instruct the genomic and chemical signals that are associated with appropriately patterning eyes, tails, and in this case, the whole structure of the organism? And I don't want to get too much into this, but what we do know in terms of the mechanism, or what we hypothesize, are that there are these radical pairs. So if we get into the spin chemistry of these, each of the molecules that exist within the body has electrons, and these electrons, the dynamics of these are one potential way for these geomagnetic fields to be influencing, which, if this is true, then every single cell and tissue and molecule in your body has an electric or electron, and then has therefore a way for it to be manipulated by these electromagnetic or magnetic fields. And if we think about therapeutic devices and using these magnetic fields within human systems, we're already there. Usually in the space of neuroscience, we can see that these electromagnetic coils, what we call transcranial magnetic stimulation, is already being used in the clinics today to mitigate depressive or altered mental states in humans. And advancements in here is all because of a simple rule. If you remember your right-hand rule from physics, it's because when you have a flow of current, you're always going to, or a flow of electrons, you're always going to have a perpendicular magnetic field that's generated. Now, I like the schematic that was adapted from David Cohen, a leader in this field. We can then relate this to biology in a very simple way. Maybe we can actually look at how magnetic field generated by just translating the simple physics to biology. So if you had a area of arbitrary shape, all you really need is some sort of source that is producing, this flow of electrons or a current that's going to give you a perpendicular magnetic field. So what we know is that in terms of bioelectricity, Galvani actually kind of started this field where he showed that in frog legs, there were tissues that, even though they weren't stimulated, so dead frog legs, when they were stimulated with these electrical currents, they moved. And we know that our brain and our cardiac tissue is highly electric. So by that logic, they should be emitting their own magnetic fields independent of, cryptochrome dependence or through these magnetite particles. So we leverage this to create these sensors. So we know that, the brain and the heart emit these magnetic fields. So we've developed these squid sensor arrays, or these magnetocardiograms, that we can leverage to non-invasively read out the state of these tissues. And this is all because the tissues generate a current. So I then argue, what about other cells? Can other cells do the same thing? Are other cells electric? Can they form a current? And the answer is absolutely. Every single cell in the body, in any biological organism, is electric, all because it can generate this membrane potential. If you know that the cell membrane, which encompasses each individual cell, is permeable to certain kinds of ions, which means that at rest, all cells are electric. They generate a membrane potential, a difference between the inside and outside environment. And this difference can be mapped based on the type of cell that it is. Michael Levin and many other people have emphasized this in showing that all cells are on sort of like a sliding scale of membrane potential, and this is highly associated with developmental and behavioral phenomenon. So, and we also see this, as you see, in gradients of tissue. So for the interest of time, I just kind of want to emphasize that every single cell and every single disease within the body has some sort of ion channel or misrepresentation of ion channel that will regulate its phenomenon. And so where we leave electromagnetism is that it could be a mechanism by measurement of their fields or intrinsic properties. We can kind of use all these mathematics to measure out these magnetic fields in tissues. And just kind of for the interest of time, I kind of want to talk a little bit about how gradient fields can form in development. We can kind of manipulate these ion channel gradients in such a way that you can kind of have animals grow with many heads or many arms, and that these ion channels are ways for us to manipulate the molecular and genetic landscape. So kind of connecting the dots here, if all cells are electric, then all cells must be magnetic. And that's kind of where we kind of link this magnetism to another phenomenon of quantum states to say that then can we use quantum units, magnetic fields, light, to interact with these ion channels, to open and close them, to change the behavior of cells. And that's exactly where my research program is going, is to kind of read and write and reprogram cell states to either A, more plastic, as in the case of stem cells, or to see how they become more plastic in, say, the case of cancer stem cells, and how we can manipulate these to become healthier cells. We've already shown that just by changing bioelectric state, we can regrow limbs. And I argue that we can do this in sort of reading and writing biological state with magnetic fields. I kind of want to, just for the interest of time, leave you with this thought. For many hundreds of years now, we've shown that magnetic fields can interact with biological tissue, whether it be geomagnetic in nature or applied. Now, the controversy comes in these applied signals, where some researchers see one effect and another researcher in another location may see the opposite. And the reasons I argue is that the importance of pattern in how the system is manipulated by the signals of magnetic fields. So I will leave it there, and I'm hoping to open this up for discussion to see where we are think of going with this field.
And Nirosha, that was fantastic. And I've scribbled down lots of my own questions, and we've got some coming in from the audience as well. But let me just kick this off by asking you, so you've spoken mainly about hypomagnetism, which means turning down the strength, but the opposite would be turning up the strength. And I'm sure that many people in our audience will have had the experience of an MRI scan where you have truly stupendous, intense magnetic fields. And you'd think, well, if a little bit of magnetism makes such a big difference, wouldn't a lot of magnetism make an even bigger difference? And should we be worried about this procedure?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So just as the MRI is actually, many Teslas in some cases in strength, they've actually shown that they can alter physiology. They can actually open and leave open the blood-brain barrier, the barrier that protects the internal brain sources from the external environment for many minutes after our MRI is turned off. So yes, just like as these small intensities of magnetic fields have an effect, large intensities could and can have an effect. The importance on how the intensities of how they have an effect is, again, where the pattern is. Most of these large intensities of fields are sine waves. So for them to have these subtle effects, maybe inducing cancer and so forth, this is where I argue that pattern needs to be there so that they can resonate with biological tissue to cause these effects. But in this day and age, when we're thinking about, kilohertz waves and high intensity, magnetic fields generated by Wi-Fi, research needs to be done in there to kind of show the biological effects that they may have.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because, of course, for some decades, people have been concerned about cell phone use. And as I understand it, a lot of studies have been done and have concluded that there's really nothing much to worry about. But I think this is a lot of this work proceeds on the assumption that the energy in these fields isn't enough to bring about major chemical changes or to make atoms jump between energy levels or anything of that sort. But I think what you have discussed with spin chemistry is that there can be downstream chemical effects even from very, very small magnetic fields, and so would you advocate more intensive studies now because we're surrounded? It's not just cell phones. We've got the power lines, and we've got our Wi-Fi in our homes and TV, and people walk around with headsets and earphones and so on. All of this needs investigating, I guess. So do you think there's still a lot of unfinished business there?
Absolutely. I argue that there clearly are some effects, but I think how we approach to designing some of these experiments need to be revisited. Tools have changed, advancements have made and been in our molecular landscape. So I think bridging scaled experiments, looking at not only in humans, but in vitro, in vivo, and kind of looking at the multiplexity of these tissues, I think those experiments need to be done to look at the effects of some of these technologies that we've made.
Now, going in the other direction, which is reduced magnetic fields, what about future bases on the moon or on Mars where the magnetic field would be much weaker? Is that a cause for concern, do you think?
I mean, we know from all the work that NASA has done with their, their flight engineers and all the astronauts that go there, is that there's already changes to astronaut physiology when they go there and when they come back in terms of their bone density and physiology. That kind of brings up an interesting story of, the different kinds of life forms that can exist that have evolved in different intensities and patterns of these magnetic fields. I would be very curious, with some of these projects that are interested in, resurrecting, say, for example, the woolly mammoth that was in a very different evolutionary period, or dinosaurs that were in this evolutionary period of these geomagnetic intensities. If we were to bring them back, how would our current geomagnetic landscape affect their physiology, and vice versa? So I think that brings up a very interesting question of evolution and how life can live in these different magnetic environments.
Well, that prompts my next question I was going to ask you, because from time to time, there are geomagnetic reversals. The north and south poles flip over. It doesn't just happen overnight. There's an extended period of fragmented, more complex fields. So at the very least, you would expect birds to get a bit confused with their navigation. But wouldn't you predict there'd be sort of biological mayhem for a bit? And is there any evidence in the fossil record that there are these episodes in history?
That warrants some investigation. I'm not aware of any of those studies, but I think that should be done. But what is interesting, where we can kind of see, is in terms of where, bird navigation is some of these changes in solar cycles. Every 11 to so years, there's a switch in solar cycles, and those are highly correlated to migratory phenomena in terms of where they end up for breeding and, brooding. So there is already some evidence to suggest that, our solar weather might influence these migratory behaviors.
So many years ago, I worked at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in England, and one of my colleagues claims that if you blindfolded him, he could tell magnetic north. He had this magnetic sensing. I took it with a pinch of salt, but from what you've said, we should take seriously the fact that some humans at least might have rudimentary magnetic sensing. It would be useful. Have you seen any evidence of that?
Absolutely. Actually, my advisor, Michael Persinger, has done a lot of work on this, where he's shown that a certain subpopulation of temporal lobe epileptics, just in the way that their neural physiology is wired, are actually sensitive to changes in local magnetic fields. Some people can feel the onset of storms, and many people in the public don't know about geomagnetic storms. So once they kind of get this information, they can kind of predict when these storms can happen. So it's not far-fetched now that we understand a little bit more about neurophysiology. And, if the brain is an electric organ, why can't it be a magnetic organ? And why can't it be receptive to magnetic influences?
I'm going to move on to some of the questions that have been coming in. And one of these goes right back to the origin of life. And if it's true that magnetism plays such a key role in life, all organisms, even microorganisms, is there any possibility that we might explain homochirality? So for the members of the audience who don't know what that is, that all known life uses left-handed amino acids and right-handed sugars. The laws of physics don't care whether it's left or right. We could imagine life would have it the other way around. Something broke that symmetry very early on. Could that be due to magnetic fields, or is that a bit of a stretch?
No, I don't think it's a stretch at all. Actually, there was some evidence of this in helical formation in DNA. We can actually see that, the way that our DNA forms in the beta coils versus the Z coils that form, they actually change their coiling direction and in the presence of certain patterns of magnetic fields. So it's not far-fetched that these intricate dynamics that we have with the geomagnetic field may have influenced chemistry formation. Oxygen, phosphorus, they're all paramagnetic materials. When we have carbon, when we have these material science properties of these elements, I think those are just inherent nature of how they interact with magnetic fields.
Now, one of the audience is asking, well, what does a single-celled organism get out of magneto sensing? You mentioned the magnetosomes in these magnetotactic bacteria. How do they make use of that information? They're not really navigating, are they? I mean, not across the planet anyway.
No, they're usually local movements. And that's something that actually I've also found a little bit curious, is that these geomagnetic fields don't necessarily move. But so, if these bacteria were just going to follow, local flux lines, then they would be moving in a small line forever indefinitely. But it's not just the geomagnetic field that they're also influenced by, but it's also environmental magnetic fields that are being produced. There are fields produced by the water, the ionic currents, and so they're also they're responding to the geological landscape in terms of the ions that are being produced in there. So it's not just the geomagnetic, but also really local magnetic fields that are generated.
Now, we've got a number of questions from Barbara Temple. The chirality one was one of them, on the health risks and benefits and so on. And we've discussed that in some detail. But do you foresee a time when we'll understand this well enough to be able to customize the magnetic environment? This might be for people, for example, with epilepsy, or sleep disorders, or just difficulty of concentrating. Can we imagine, just like we create quiet spaces, shut out the noise? Some people work better that way. Some people like a background ambience. We're all different. Will we have sort of customized magnetic environment, do you think?
That's the future that I hope for and that I'm working towards. And that's, I guess, where this idea of pattern comes from. All of these magnetic devices that exist, again, are usually sine waves, and I'd like to argue that they're non-specific in their target, in their biology. What I'd like to argue, now that we have a better understanding of how that magnetism arises, that we can target these biological sources magnetically to, we've already shown that applied magnetic fields can, change cancer rates, but we've also shown that they can also change pain perception. Something that a phenomenon that we understand a little bit about is the concept of pain. So I'd like to see a future where we can influence biological fields in a way that is normal for us.
It seems to me that there's a danger because anything to do with fields, people have a sort of mystical view of it, and I know that there are a lot of rather sort of wacky folk remedies involving magnetism and possibly even gravitation. You know, a lot of stuff out there. It's difficult, is it not, for someone like yourself wanting to take a rigorous scientific view in areas that may impact human health and health practices to sort of navigate through that flaky landscape, if I could put it that way. Do you experience difficulties yourself? Or do people say
Absolutely.
to you, well, you know, I sleep with magnets under my bed and it's helped my blood pressure, and what do you think of that?
No, I mean, this whole hokey aspect of magnetic fields has been around, which has done no service to the advancement in the field. And I think that's where, as a collective, helping to answer this question in a very systematic and rigorous way will help alleviate some of those mysticisms. And I think, you know, this work in magnetic fields has existed, you know, for centuries now. And if you look at the advancements that we've made in terms of the healthcare space, it's actually very little in terms comparing other advancements in the use of magnetic fields. And truthfully, it's because we don't, the field of scientific exploration in term biology has kind of took a divergence in the chemical aspect because we had our tools developed as such. And if we can kind of make those same advancements we have with the magnetic technologies, then I think we have a chance to blend them together. As all aspects of things that can't be proven, there needs to be a testable hypothesis and data-driven work that can actually prove that this is useful.
Well, that does bring me to the next question, which is the beauty, at least, of the bird navigation research is that there is a mechanism. Of course, that's a hypothesis, but it's a fairly detailed mechanism involving spin chemistry. And we've got a few minutes, and we do have a question from somebody asking about the how these birds do it and quantum entanglement within the cryptochrome. You had to sort of gloss over a little bit of that because it is a bit technical, but I think we can indulge just for a few minutes. Could you say a little bit more about how that actually works? How is it that the radical ion spins are able to give the bird an impression of where north is?
Right. So in terms of magnetic sensitivity, some sort of protein in a biological system needs to be able to be oriented to a magnetic field. And that biological source in birds is usually through this cryptochrome protein. And in spin chemistry, there are these two states where you have, and it's all based on the spin, direction of spin of these electrons. And there are essentially two states, but in the presence of the magnetic field, that singlet state gets transformed into a triplet state. And in that process, we can actually measure the change in which these protein dynamics move in response to these magnetic fields. So, but if you actually boil it down from a biological perspective, these proteins need to be interacting from an electronic, from each of their electrons in the presence of a magnetic field. And what's interesting is that the amount of energy required, which has been a point of contention forever, is that we need a high amount of energy, is actually low. So these radical pair mechanism doesn't actually require high intense fields, but in the order of the same intensity of the geomagnetic fields in low microtesla ranges can cause that singlet state to be transformed into the triplet state. So I think that's sort of like the high level version of that.
Some of our non-physics audience may not know what a singlet and a triplet state is, but let me just boil this down to its basics, that all electrons spin, their little spinning bodies all have exactly the same amount of spin, and because they're electrically charged particles, that produces an intrinsic magnetic field. So all electrons are like little magnets in their own right, and so magnetism is right there in the fundamental structure of matter. But the upshot of this mechanism, if I understand it correctly, depending on the particular quantum state that is affected by the magnetic field is that these spins and how they're oriented and how they are correlated between the pair can affect the chemistry, the downstream chemistry. If it's spinning like this, it makes substance A, spinning like that makes substance B. And those are neurotransmitters, so that the bird will literally see maybe, shadows or something, patterns in the visual field that gives rise to, that indicates the magnetic direction. Did I get that right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, good.
And so we also see this in regular metabolism as well. So birds might have this, but we also see this in our reactive oxygen species that is within our mitochondria. So all the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, has potential to be magnetoreceptive as well. Some of these biochemical reactions that you may have heard in high school chemistry of creating FADH or NADH, those states that we've learned from FAD to FADH, flavin type molecules that are associated with metabolism, have implications in these radical pair mechanisms too. So we might be ingrained that our metabolism is rooted in magnetism.
So now we have a question from Steve Ruff, and this is revisiting something we were talking about a little earlier, about whether a magnetic field is important for the origin of life. Could we imagine that life would not arise on a planet with a very weak magnetic field, or in an environment with no magnetic field? Of course, we don't know how life began, so this is pure speculation. But have you ever thought about this one?
I've thought about it, especially as we, as humans start to think about space exploration into other planets. I think the concept of life as we know it has been ingrained in magnetic fields, but it's hard to say. And if we look at similar planets of similar size and atmospheric conditions, they all have a magnetic field. So can we say that life can't exist without magnetic fields? Perhaps they can. Maybe they're different in what we call life as we compare to what we know as life with a magnetic atmosphere. So I think that's my answer for that, and from what I know as evolution and magnetic space.
So now, leaping from the basic question, the origin of life, to the example of the fox. So we have a question from Peter Conan. Since that signal is originating in the retina, is it lighting up visual centers in the brain of the fox? Well, we just sort of talked about that in connection with birds, but presumably, is that the same thing? Is the fox going to actually see what's going on?
So an interesting thing with all of these radical pair mechanisms and cryptochrome is cryptochrome actually requires a low level of light for it to function as a magnetic sensor. And we know that some of these wavelengths of light are within the blue range. So it's not far-fetched to think that some of the photoreceptors or opsins that are within the retina are also magnetic sensitive and might be coupled to some of these cryptochrome-like genes. We know that humans have them. We know actually there's certain researchers out there who are looking at magnetoreception through the retina. And it might be, sequencing the fox genome, we might actually see that they also have cryptochrome in their structures as well.
So when I first learned about cryptochrome, I thought it was some, funny specialized molecule that only birds have. But I guess that molecules like that are fairly widespread
Absolutely.
in life, because we have a question about that there's human cryptochrome, and is it possible to do you know if anybody's done any studies looking at the phylogenetic tree of cryptochrome? Because it'll have a common origin, it'll go back a long way in evolutionary history, might give us a clue as to just how ancient this magnetic sensing is.
I have, through these, quantum meetings, I have heard of researchers looking at the phylogenetic change in some of these cryptochrome. Certain species of cyanobacteria have expression of cryptochrome, and cyanobacteria being one of the oldest organisms that exists on our planet, might give us some insights into how far back this cryptochrome expression can be. We also see it in plants. We see it throughout, many levels of the phylogenetic tree. So I do know of people looking at it, and that'd be something I would like, individuals looking at fossil records, as you mentioned, looking at some of that genetic sequences and see if there's any homologies between our cryptochrome in birds currently, and even in the ones in the past. If we can get some of that data, that'd be very interesting.
Yeah. Now, there's a couple of questions about life in the oceans. One from Angelica and the other from Derek. Are there studies on dolphins and whales? Because navigating in the ocean, well, there is a lot of movement that goes on in the ocean. The magnetic environment, I don't know. Is it very different? How important is magnetic navigation for aquatic?
The French scientist that I introduced at the very beginning had the same question from 1884 or whenever, but from the atmosphere, when we look at birds, ocean organisms also use a magnetic field to locomote. But the fields are a little bit different because of the local environment that they're in. Water is highly sensitive to magnetic field changes. And some of these organisms, like the electric eel, for example, they generate their own magnetic fields from their gill patterns, from their electric lines. Other organisms do use, dolphins and other organisms do use the geomagnetic lines for breeding and navigating back to where they were born. There are some really interesting studies that have been shown that dolphins return back to the area where they were born to die. So how do they recognize those spaces? It cannot be chemistry that they've left behind, since they move and they migrate over many thousands of kilometers. In some of those experiments, they actually argue that it's the geomagnetic patterns in those areas. And we know that there are geomagnetic hotspots throughout the planet, just by looking at the equator and the flux lines around the world. So there's lots of evidence to show that aquatic organisms use magnetic fields and also generate magnetic fields for their counterparts.
Well, we're almost out of time, but there's one final question, and it sort of relates to these same things. This is from Catherine. What variations are evident from equatorial to northern latitudes? So around about the equator, you showed the picture, the angle of dip is sort of very low. So are there noticeable differences, say, in navigation patterns or the use of magnetic field generally between the equator and the poles?
Interestingly enough, there's also changes in human behavior just based on equatorial location magnetic fields, and those who have migrated to higher magnetic fields, there's changes in their physiology. Some might, correlate that to the amount of sunlight that one exhibits, but there's another phenomenon which we didn't get a chance to talk about, but the Schumann resonance. The Schumann resonance is something that is an atmospheric phenomenon that's brought on by lightning strikes, where lightning strikes produce a local field that's within the atmosphere that certain humans are perceptive to. That Schumann resonance kind of localizes within the equator and changes as it goes towards the North and South Pole. So the short answer to that is yes, human behavior and animal behavior is highly, influenced by these flux lines at the equator and at the poles.
And the really last question, also from Catherine, because it relates to this, that magnetism is everywhere, and it's a sort of complicated thing, and yet even these rather simple animals can somehow discern the bit of the magnetic field that's important to them and untangle it from all the other stuff that's around them. That seems extraordinary, but life is extraordinary. Do you have any last words on that? How do you sort out the signal from the noise?
Now that's the money right there. The money is how do we differentiate the signal from the noise? The geomagnetic field is always going to be around, and that's where kind of the slide in the background where the importance of pattern comes in. These fluctuations, disturbances that we get from the earth are disruptions in the noise that we can pick up, punctate points where we can look at animal and human behavior. And even in the world of applied magnetic fields, simulating some of these very clear patterns, we can then see the effects of these applied complex patterns and see how they're different from the background noise. So I think that's a great place to end off, to actually emphasize the importance of pattern in animal physiology.
Well, an end we must, because at the very least you'll want to go get some dinner. It's late where you are. It's been fantastic, Nirosha. I mean, you really have taught us so much and so many things to think about. You'll probably be flooded with email questions now from our audience, but thank you very much for a really fascinating and well presented talk. And thank you, the audience, for your participation. Next time, today we've been back to the origin of life, but next time we're going back even further than that, to the origin of the universe and the Big Bang. That's Brian Keating will be talking to us about, was there actually a Big Bang or something else that happened? And so that's 1 month today, Monday evening. So look forward to seeing you all again then. And one last thank you to Nirosha for your fascinating talk. And good night, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.